Okay, and then it's just all set whenever you're ready.
Awesome. Thanks, Max. Yeah, I'll be sharing this stuff.
Yeah.
Shall I get started, everyone? Before I introduce myself, I guess I'll just ask you all to just say your name real fast. No background history or anything. Or nothing about your family. Just your name, and that's probably enough. Just so I know who I'm speaking to. I know this is Max. I just met him.
Deb.
Deb?
Simmering like on the stove.
Simmering like on the stove. That's your full name, Simmering like on the stove.
Remember my name?
All right, Simmering. Ed, all right. I met Conrad earlier today. All right. Christy. Christy and I share a cubicle together. We're getting a wall between us soon.
Yeah, I guess so. Crystal.
Crystal, I know we also work together.
Tiffany.
Tiffany, hi, nice to meet you. Tiffany.
Lindsay.
Lindsay.
Yes.
Lindsay, nice to meet you.
Mira.
Marilyn. Nice to meet you, Marilyn.
Michelle.
Michelle.
Robin.
Robin.
Diana.
Diana. Yeah. I met her yesterday for her birthday.
Trace.
Trace.
Okay.
How did you say it?
Trace.
Trace, sorry.
That's okay. Tina.
Tina.
Letha.
Letha. I used to make students years ago memorize everyone's name. I'm not going to memorize all of your names, but I feel like on this side of the room pretty good. Like the cognitive overload, which is coming up in the next session, I think hit around the back row there. So I think I remember a few of your names, but with continued exposure, I'm sure I get all of your names within a short time. So my name is Anthony. My family pronounces it Saba, S-A-B-A. I'm originally from New York City. Grew up in New York, Staten Island, if any of you are familiar with the area. Went to school in upstate New York City, Binghamton. Went off to South Korea in 1998. Purportedly for a year, spent 18 years there instead. My affiliation with Boise State University started in 2009 when my daughter was, right after my daughter was born. I started doing my Master's of Educational Technology there. And started hearing a lot of great things about Boise State University and the city of Boise. Started to get intrigued. And then by 2012, I was working for Hyundai and Kia, their leadership development center in South Korea. And I started also at the same time, new job, I started teaching online for ed tech at Boise State and started my doctoral degree as well. And had my third child around the same time. So it was a pretty crazy time period. I survived. I just finished my doctorate last year. And so my presentation today is related a lot to my experiences teaching online and also my doctoral dissertation, which was Instructor immediacy in online courses. So let's see, get it going here. So first of all, first question, are you familiar with the term immediacy? If you are, please just raise your hand. Probably not, right? Second question, are you familiar with the term social presence? Raise your hand if you are. Okay. So the word social presence, when I started talking with my advisor, Patrick Lowenthal, I'm sure a few of you know him at Tech at Boise State, we were talking about my interest. My interest in this topic came from my experiences teaching online. So I really found that, as much as my content expertise and so on, as long as I gave feedback and stuff, my students seemed to like me, but it was like this ability for me to provide a lot of, immediate kind of feedback to them. Being there for them, this kind of really the soft side of it, which was related to my experience with leadership development as well at the same time. The soft side of it was really what was, I was thinking was really what students were finding to be helpful, more so than my expertise in the area or anything. And so at the same time, I was, talking with leaders in a lot of our, at that time, the Korean companies in the US and in Europe. And I was asking directors, we were trying to figure out what the people that are coming after them would need, what skills and talents they would need. And they're saying, we don't need people with expertise in engineering so much for our next level of leadership as much as we need things like communication skills, right? You hear this a lot. And so I started realizing that it wasn't necessarily my expertise that made me a great teacher, but it was my communication skills with my students that really tapping into that human side of teaching. And so that's why I decided to do my research on it. And when we were talking about social presence, and I started really wondering, what do people even mean by this term? And it started kind of evolved into this discussion of this concept of immediacy as I started investigating it more. And over the last 2 years or so, I've become kind of frustrated with this term social presence because everyone knows what it means, but no one knows what it really means. Because I think it's just, we all do, like, I want to ask people, well, where did you get exposed to this term? When was the last time you actually read a definition that we all agree upon of what that social presence is? And most people, I think, are just intuitively thinking, I know what it means because I use social media and I like the sense of people being present. So my first goal of my dissertation research was to kind of parse out the difference between these two, which was more challenging than I thought. Because I remember Patrick said to me, the idea of social presence, a lot of people think it's this like really fuzzy, warm, community building kind of feeling. But a drill sergeant, when they're in your face yelling and the spittle's hitting you, can have just as much social presence as someone, giving you a massage, right? So either one of those would be a very high level of social presence, not necessarily something that's going to make you feel happy and pleased and pleasant and fuzzy and all that. So that's what I want to do today for you first, is to kind of parse out the difference between these two. I'm actually Patrick and I are doing a presentation at AECT about this in October. And then I want to get into my research and talk about some of the findings that I had as far as what leads to an instructor being very immediate for their students. And so, how many of you teach for Boise State? Did you get your student evaluations this morning? Yeah. I got mine as well, and something changed a lot for me in the last year. Around the same time I finished my dissertation, was that my evaluations have become a lot more consistent in the last year. My evaluations went from typically being a little bit above the department average, somewhere around 4.4, but it was inconsistent. Some semester I'd get a 4.2, some semesters I'd get a 4.7 or so. But for the last 3 semesters, I've had a consistent 4.9 as far as my faculty side. And then for my content, it's been fluctuating around 4.6 to 4.8. So it's kind of interesting to me because I'm an instructional designer for Boise State University. I work at the Campus Center. My teaching is getting higher evaluations than my design. I'm like, yeah, that's supposed to be really good on this side. But the point is that I've been starting to implement a lot of the findings from my research, and it really hasn't taken a lot more effort. In fact, it's been more enjoyable for me as well. And so let me start by introducing some of the stuff there. So immediacy, the construct. We don't have a clicker, so I'm probably going to be behind here more than I like to be. But basically, the definition of it is behaviors that reduce the physical and their psychological distance between people. And it's based on the idea of verbal and nonverbal cues that signal a sense of approach. Like, you can come to me, feel free to approach me, right? We think about the different things that, if you think back to maybe the days when you were dating or something, how do you signal to someone that you want them to approach? Well, you probably wouldn't cross your arms, you probably wouldn't turn away from them, you probably wouldn't hide behind a lecture, you probably wouldn't just stare at your slides the whole time. It's quite the opposite, right? You open yourself up, you make eye contact, you learn people's names and things like this. So it's this idea of verbal and nonverbal communication that signals, please, you're welcome to approach me. It also requires the idea of lowering this power gap that may exist between you and I. So it's related to the idea that the more you arouse people in a pleasing way, the more it will lead to liking, and then that in turn will lead to the idea that they can approach you. So again, high arousal that is pleasing, right, smiling, saying your name, things like that, will lead to liking, which can lead then to people feeling a sense that they can approach you, especially when you're mitigating the sense of power gap between you. So that's the kind of really short explanation of it. A lot of this was based on Hall's studies of proxemics, which of course is different across cultures, but there's still the same sense that there's an intimate space, a social space, and a public space, and also this idea of personal space. It has a long history in the field of education and communications fields, especially in the classroom, not so much in online education. How many of you are online teachers? All right, so most of you here. Goes back into the 1960s when they started looking at the difference, in social presence and also in immediacy. So, but some of the benefits of it that have been found throughout the years, again, most of this research comes from classroom-based, is the idea that it improves students' intent to persist, satisfaction, it improves learning across different ethnic groups and genders. This concept of immediacy holds across all different areas of demographics. There may be some small differences in how you communicate across cultures, for example, but really not much difference in gender and so on. It also has improved, student attendance, participation, decreases anxiety in classrooms, decreases communication apprehension, and it improves perceptions of instructors as caring about you, being trustworthy and so on. So here are a lot of the standard indicators of nonverbal immediacy. Nonverbal immediacy is what they kind of started with, right? So again, things like sitting behind the desk, we talked about this already a little bit, but gestures while you're talking, moving around the classroom, right? If you think about all the things that you've experienced with really good instructors, right? What are the things that they did? Well, a lot of these behaviors probably aren't surprising to you. The ones with the asterisks are considered to be non-immediate, right? It's the opposite, they're inverse measures. So sitting behind the desk would not be an immediate behavior.
Number 7 would probably be different today.
Yes.
And so this one has actually been dropped from more recent ones. So the most recent version of them goes down to 10 indicators now. So a few of these have been removed. Touching students in class, they found that it's more common in elementary school grades, where it's more appropriate than not in especially higher education. But we can still, so some more recent research has done is try to use metaphorical concepts of touching, like touching you emotionally in a metaphorical way, right? So the idea that you've been touched, but not physically. And here are the verbal immediacy indicators. Again, these have all been for classroom-based education. So things like using personal examples, asking questions, and encouraging students to talk, getting into discussions based on things students have brought. So if students have brought up a question, well, we'll talk about that later, or that's not relevant, or something would be immediate, non-immediate behavior, right? Using humor. There's a lot of research on humor, right, and how effective that is in classrooms. One of my research findings wasn't online, but that wasn't actually a highly measured, it wasn't a strong indicator in online. And in one of my interviews, one of the students said, well, it's kind of dangerous to use humor in online because people can easily misinterpret it. So, so addressing students by name and allowing students to address you by name is a big indicator as well. Getting into conversations with students before and after class. So, the instructor that comes in at the very last minute and leaves as soon as the time is up without staying at the desk, right, or the lectern being available for students would be a non-immediate behavior. So I can go through the whole list with you, but if you want, I can send you the list, or you can just look it up online. I don't think we want to sit here and watch me read a list of indicators. So for my dissertation, what I had to do is I had to go through and come up with some new indicators. So social presence. So the concept of social presence goes back actually to 1972 when Short et al. Wrote a book about the construct. But it really became popular in 1997 when it was, in a sense, appropriated for online education. And a problem with it was when they appropriated it for online, they misconstrued it. And so this is what Patrick and I are going to be talking about at ACT. They misconstrued it in a sense to make it sound like it was something that was, again, warm and fuzzy, community-oriented. Why? Well, because they were also at the same time introducing the community of inquiry model. And so for the community of inquiry model, what they did was they took this term social presence and then redefined it and measured it using immediacy constructs. So they actually Swan himself took the immediacy scales that I just showed you, took out several of the elements, put it into this thing that she called social presence scale, and called it social presence, but it was actually immediacy. And social presence has a very different meaning, which I will explain to you in a moment here. So first of all, it's not again about being nice and so on. Short it all, what they said was, immediacy, social presence is actually a few things. The first one is the presence of other, they were looking at office workers at the time. The presence of other people affects your behavior. And I discovered this firsthand during my dissertation research. Why? Well, I was going to my office on weekends, and there's usually 80 or so people in the office. But when no one's there, I can feel free to scream stuff like, holy crap, I hate this! I don't do that during normal hours, I swear. Christy can attest to that.
Yeah, sure.
I may say it under my breath, but the fact that but I remember when I would be working there on weekends, sometimes someone would come in, and immediately the way I was behaving in the office was modified. I changed the way I was behaving. I wasn't suddenly screaming out words. I wasn't walking around like a lunatic. I quickly brush my hair and brought myself to composure, and so on. So the influence, the simple presence of other people affects your behavior. Think about a micromanaging manager versus a manager that doesn't micromanage, right? When I worked in my Korean company, that we were set up in cubicles where it was 8 people facing each other, and the team leader was at the end of the table looking out at all of you. The entire 16-hour shift, right? So that's the way that's the way you were set up. So very different than my boss. And I sit at the one cubicle where my boss can see directly where I'm sitting. That affects me, believe it or not, So the presence of others influences our behavior. Teacher's coming, teacher's coming. I used to teach at elementary school for a short time. You get a student screaming that when you're walking down the hall, they all suddenly run and sit down and kind of make everything fun. Right? So you can all, I'm sure, agree with that. So another point about what they found was that the nature of a task is related to the level of social, emotional cues required for its accomplishment. Think about that. Why do we choose to communicate with people in certain ways? If someone, I don't know if you have any children, maybe you're a traditionalist, and a man emails you or texts you and says, I'd like to marry your daughter. How would you feel about that? Like the traditional way, you don't imagine a romantic text message, I'd like your daughter's hand in marriage. You expect a higher level of social emotional interaction. You expect that person to probably come to your home or sit down with you, maybe show a bit of humbleness. And so you expect that more higher level social interaction. So it's about the idea of the social, being able to transmit these socio-emotional cues, verbally and non-verbally, often to show that you genuinely care, that you are genuine, that you are, and so on. So these cues. So if you imagine, especially when I was working for a Korean company, and it's very, emotions are a very big part of it, you know to express it. And so anytime you wanted to get money from accounting, you had to go to headquarters and go to the accounting person and talk to them in person. And that was the way to actually get the extra budget. It wasn't just sending them an email and trying to get the money. You think about large organizations. Why do they spend millions of dollars a year flying executives across the world to sit down and have a head-to-head meeting? It's not because you need to communicate in that way to get the information, but you need to get that other information, that social, emotional communication. So that's the second aspect of it. So the nature of the task is affected by the way perceptions of that level as well. So if you perceive that a certain task requires that face-to-face, but the other person only provides you an email, you're going to have to feel some sense of ingenuine intention and so on. So if you perceive that the other person should come to your office and speak to you face-to-face, but they don't do that, you're not going to feel that sense of presence. So this is, again, really common in business and so on. Effects of communication in the medium the effects of a communication medium also affects the presence of a person. So video has a higher fidelity of presence than just audio. And audio has a higher sense of presence than text. It doesn't mean that text cannot be mitigated to add more presence, but it does mean that if you want to increase your level of social presence, you should elevate the level of fidelity of the communication that you're using to communicate with your students, for example. So, for example, if you want to develop a sense of camaraderie among your students, a sense of community, what's the best communication to do that in your class, you think?
I do face-to-face discussion groups so that they can see each other and to me.
Face-to-face online? Okay, so live synchronous video?
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry, that's the technical word.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah.
Question again?
So what if you want to develop, if your task or your goal is to develop a high level sense of community among your students, what would be the best way to have them communicate with each other or with you? Face-to-face. If you're not able to come together in person, video, face-to-face, high quality video, build latency in the communication, these types of things. Now, if your task is just to let students know that there's going to be a test on Friday, is it a good thing to have them all reserve an hour at 9 p.m. on Friday night to meet with you during a video chat to say, we're going to have a test on Thursday at 7 p.m.? No, because they're going to perceive that you use too high of a level of fidelity to transmit a low level task information. So that level of your task requires certain levels of communication. So if it's a low level just transfer of information, a low fidelity transmission of communication, social emotional cues and so forth will be effective enough. But if you require someone to come and meet you in a very high fidelity channel of communication for this very low grade level of information, it can be considered a waste of their time by them, probably. So these are what Short et al. Found to be what social presence is. It's not, again, about the sense of fuzziness. So again, the idea of social presence, the idea of a cop or police officer walking the beat is very different than a peace officer walking through the community to help the community and so on. So again, social presence can have a very different impact depending on the nature of the communication. Again, like I said, the nature of the task can then dictate what level of communication you should A, use, or B, people perceive you should use. Again, like this, right? So again, the effect of the communication medium itself can also impact how much social presence people feel. Okay, so my study was on instructor immediacy and fully online courses at Boise State University. And so at our university, we have what are called self-supported programs, and we have non-self-supported programs. Self-supported programs basically are outside of the regular funding model for departments. And so non-self-supported programs, at least what I looked at was the non-self-supported, or programs that go through the standard funding model at Boise State University. Ed Tech right now is currently moving to a non-self-supported model. Okay, so there's an available pool of about 844 students that I can look at. And so I ended up getting responses from around 170 students that I used for my data. So all the students use the same LMS in these non-self-supported programs. They have all been developed by eCampus Center where I work. They all went through similar design process. They all belong to programs that are standardized using Blackboard. And they all receive the same level of support from eCampus. So they all have a lot of similar factors. The gender of my sample was mostly female. The location was split between, outside the U.S., outside of the Northwest region and within the Northwest region. And then the semester, they really were, various semesters.
Does that mean semesters, how long they had attended?
Yeah, this is what semester they were currently in their program. And so the mean was about 36 as far as age. Yeah. Okay, so my first research question was, to what degree do students in fully online program courses perceive their instructors to be immediate? And by the way, like I mentioned earlier, I had to redevelop that scale for an online context. So they've typically found that they had, this is on a 0 to 4 scale. So the mean was 2.818. So the total immediacy was 2.4. So they found them to be, somewhat in the middle, right? Kind of.
4 being the highest.
4 being the highest. 0 non-immediate. Yeah. And this was my full, this was the full response number N for the study. To what degree do students in fully online programs, again, perceive their instructors to be immediacy? And this was the verbal immediacy scale. So these were the different indicators, and I put them in order from highest to lowest for the mean. So provided feedback on work was the most highly immediate behavior that students presented. And adjustment by name was a second, and we can go down. But interesting things were like inquired how students felt was immediate, but it wasn't like one of the highest indicators, right? So it was really more of the praise of their work, so really work-oriented. So just being friendly with students wasn't really the highly considered thing, right? Initiate communication is nice, but if you're like, hey, how you doing, Joe? And that's it. It wasn't really that important to students. So again, it was recognition of their name, recognition of their work, providing feedback, detailed feedback, and so on were the higher related things.
Question.
Mhm.
The second one addressed me by name. Would that be just like in their emails and discussion posts or something?
Or on their feedback?
in every way. So later on, I did the interview. So it was basically across the board, right? Like you were sending them individualized emails. And that's one of the things I do now with my students since this was rather than send out an email to 40 students, welcome to the semester, I literally go and copy and paste the same email and put every student's name individually in there. And I wish we had a system that would allow us to do that, like Qualtrics does for surveys, for example. But it doesn't allow me to do that. So I do spend the time, but that has a return on the investment later on. Yes?
You address them by first name or using their family?
I will use, like, for example, Nathaniel, and then I'll put in parentheses, Nate, question mark, and then I'll ask them in the email, how do you like to be addressed? Because it is a culturally sensitive thing for some people. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Necessarily like being addressed by their first name.
That's right. So I will use their first name basis because I found most of my students are from Idaho, and I'd done cultural training in the past for Hyundai, and so I understand that certain cultures, but we are also working within the American institution from the Midwest, from the West, where we do tend to use a first name basis. So I asked them, "Are you comfortable using your first name?" So that isn't to ask, Nate, Nathaniel, Nate, how do you like to be addressed? And then most students will come back with, actually, I have not had a single student that says, please call me Mr. Joe or something like that, like Koreans would do, or please call me KS or something like that.
What about the way the instructor requires the student to address them? Doctor.
Yeah, so the immediacy indicator is that students, that you allow students to call you by your first name. And so I've done that with most of my students, and I would say about 80% of my students will shift to Anthony, and some will still call me Mr. And I don't know why no one calls me doctor even since I got my doctorate, but whatever, right? Yeah, they still go with Mr. I'm not sure why. Yeah, so these were the verbal immediacy indicators. And for the non-verbal immediacy indicators, again, this is the R indicate a reversed. So tense communication, the reverse is non-tense communication, or I guess easygoing communication might be the way you consider it. So easygoing communication, again, related to this idea of more of a egalitarian communication style, using first names and so on. Hey, how are you doing? Feel free to contact me, things like that. Being attentive to students, really high, right? Responsiveness probably is related to that idea, being attentive to students. Being pleasant and friendly, right? That kind of hardcore, strict professor, do it my way. I'm an educator. I've been doing this for 30 years. Do it my way. It doesn't go over online, especially. Seemed passive, again, so very actively involved professor is what they are finding to be immediate, and so on and so forth. So at the bottom of the list, using physical metaphors, probably that's that touch one, right? Being translated into this online. It doesn't really seem to be much of an indicator, so probably this can be dropped from the list of indicators. Using of creative expression, right? Creatively communicating with people. It's nice to do, but probably not that important of an immediacy indicator. So if you were doing all of these things, that's probably great. But if you're going to choose the things that you should, prioritize, probably the first 5 here or so are the most important. So the second research question was, what is the relationship between perceived instructor immediacy and learning in fully online courses? So in this field of research with immediacy, they've typically measured perceptions of learning because it's so hard to measure, cognitive learning, right? Because how do you measure it across courses? How do you compare it? And there's been a lot of research that have found that students are generally pretty good at judging how much they've learned, right? If they say that they've learned a lot and you test them, they're probably pretty close to being accurate in that. There's some debate on that, but in the field, effective learning has been consistently found across the research, hundreds and hundreds of studies in the classroom especially, that higher immediacy leads to higher sense of affective learning. In other words, things like values and so on of the field, and sense of motivation and so on. Perceptions of learning has been pretty consistent, but the impact of it has been found to not be as strong as the effective learning impact of immediacy. But course satisfaction has been found to have quite a high impact. So students tend to find immediate instructors to be more satisfying, not a big surprise there. But they also find that they lead to higher sense of affective and cognitive learning. So again, for verbal immediacy and for nonverbal immediacy, it was interesting to find that the verbal immediacy had a higher impact on, the nonverbal has a higher impact on affective. Why? Because it's not what you say that makes people, kind of take on your values, but it's what you do, right? So if someone's sitting there smoking a cigarette and saying you should be healthy and you should exercise and live a healthy lifestyle, what they're saying isn't probably going to impact you as much as what they're doing, right? I go to the gym sometimes, and when I see these, some of the gym coaches, right? They're in great shape, and I'm like, that's the guy I want to train me. And then you see some other gym trainers, and they're like, really, that guy's a trainer? Like, I don't know. I think he can probably bulk up or something. I don't know, slim down or something. Yeah.
What were the measures for online nonverbal immediacy?
These were the measures. For nonverbal were these.
I don't know how, I guess what I'm trying to figure out is how to quantify that from an online presence when you're not directly.
Okay.
You use monotone flat style.
I understand your question.
How is that, relaxed style communication? I mean, I can kind of see how, you might be, you could do that in written format, but variety of tones, I find that difficult. Conceptualize.
So the way you write has a tone. Why? Because when someone's reading your text, they're hearing your voice. And so when they hear your voice, they might hear that you're being sharp and curt, you're being sarcastic, you're being arrogant, you're being pleasant, you're being friendly. So that sense that they can perceive through your text. And there's a whole field of study with the immediacy field and in linguistics about how you use language, how you use punctuation, the terms and so on, the way you say our class versus my class. In my class, we're going to do this. In our class, we are going to do this. So the way you use the grammatical structures you use, there's a whole area of it's all in my dissertation. I'll give you the whole report. But yeah, it's a great question.
It's still, even though it's in written, it's still a verbal communication. Is how.
So there's certain things. So again, it can be emoticons. That can be a nonverbal indicator. It can be the time within your response.
Okay, that makes
indicator. The grammatical structure. That's nonverbal, right? It's not necessarily, for example, vocalics, right? Vocalics are in a sense kind of nonverbal verbal blend, right? So the way your voice is, the words you're choosing and so on can all be nonverbal indicators within that verbal language.
But that can also be, and I don't want to take up much time, but that can also be entirely based upon the mood of the person reading it at the time.
Absolutely.
So I mean, the control of that is much less, and I guess that's really what I'm kind of focused on. If you have somebody that is just in an angry mood, they're going to read whatever you say in that tone. So that is not you don't have your control of that so much less.
Yes.
Than.
So an interesting thing within the immediacy research, also one of my findings also is that there's a building of that kind of like that bank account, right? You're investing in that, and so and so if you're being immediate with your students, and then you have a moment of frustration, they're more willing to be forgiving of that if you've been building this sense of immediacy overall. But if you're being non-immediate, and this is interesting, one of the findings is, if you're being non-immediate with your students and suddenly you're starting to be friendly or nice, they find that to be much more genuine than if you just, because students prefer instructors who are consistently jerks than jerks most of the time and sometimes nice.
No, and I completely get that. I mean, there is this concern of how friendliness is interpreted, probably more from male instructors and female instructors, but still. And so, where is that line of professionalism versus, hey, how's it going? Hope you have a good, so that would, I'm just wondering how you cross that.
Well, a couple of my findings, I think, speak to that to a degree, especially the androgynous communication style is one of the findings. So I'll cover that, and then if you have more time, I can stick afterwards and discuss it more.
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
published, if you have it published.
This is published right now.
If you have your paper, then.
Yeah. Okay, I'll send it out for sure, absolutely.
I had a question with this, talking about visual, video. So whether you did like a lecture with you, actually a picture of you, or the sound of your voice with a PowerPoint, that type of thing. How was that? How would?
I have a really interesting finding about that too, which we're almost there, so.
Sorry.
Let me go on 5 minutes and we'll come back for another round of discussion. And feel free to interrupt us if you do have a question. But I have a slide that speaks to it really well, so that specific question. It's like 3 or 4 ahead. So let me get to that and then I'll definitely come back to it. So yeah, so the research question 2. And 3 also, asked what is the relationship between instructor immediacy and student satisfaction in online courses? So just trying to remember where I was. Okay, yeah, so comparing them, right? The highest impact was asked questions, right? That the instructor asked questions of the students, which is not surprising, right? Because you're engaging them. Again, if you go back to the idea of people, dating or something, if you ask someone questions, you're showing interest in them. You're showing interest in their perception. Also, providing feedback on their work, right? Detailed feedback is what we're talking about, not just, I knew one professor, he would write agreeable on everything. That was his feedback. What does that mean? It's horrible. It's actually horrible feedback. Agreeable. It doesn't even make any sense. I will not name names. So as far as the nonverbal immediacy, the highest rated ones were paid attention to students and seemed distant personally. That was the strongest relationships. What I did was a split sample ranking. So I split the sample into high and low, and I found that these were the highest, right? V2, which was, if I go back, I can't remember what I say anymore. It's true, after you finish your dissertation, you don't remember anything anymore. So ask questions in the split sample as well. Yeah, there you go. Thank you. I knew I covered my bases. And then again, the question was, what instructor behaviors do students perceive contribute to immediacy in fully online programs? So, what I had done here was, again, I split the sample so that it tried to look at the differences between highly immediate and non-immediate instructors. And so this was, again, the idea of seeming close to them, which totally makes sense with the immediacy construct, the idea of being approachable, right? If you seem close, it means that you've already approached me or allowed me to approach you. And so really important was the reply speed, the strong finding there. Reply speed, I asked the question, how quickly the instructor respond to questions? And again, correlated that with immediacy. So verbal immediacy had a pretty strong relationship, but nonverbal immediacy. So that was your question before, right? How does, if you're sending an email, writing text, well, it's that time of response.
And would that include saying, hey, I see your question, I would like to give it more time?
I think so. I think so, because I do that, for example, with students, right? If they're doing text messaging with me or Hangouts, and I might say, great question, it's due on Thursday, or I might say, great question, I'll send you an email because it's going to require more information. It might be a response like, hey, let's do a video chat tonight, depending on the situation. If a student's freaking out and they're emotionally upset, it might require a phone call in that case. Again, raising that level of communication fidelity depending on the task that needs to be accomplished. If a student's screaming out to you, I need help, you're having an emotional outfit, and you're just sending them emails, you're not really meeting them at the level of their need at that point, even if you're being nice in your email.
Well, and what they're sending you and having a problem. I mean, I had a student the end of the semester email me about a work thing. They got fired from their job and they were dealing with different thoughts of suicide.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to take a lot more care in your response to them to show that you are aware and cognizant of their issue.
Right.
And then find a way to say, but let's also talk soon about what you think is feasible with your, as opposed to like, well, the project is due Tuesday.
And here's a resource for you to reach. And here's a resource for you to reach out to, because
Finding so even if the response is like, thank you so much, but let me
right.
get back to you later. A lot of that comes down to what they're what their email is, yeah.
right? So I want to, like, the task nature of this of me wants to move on, but the immediacy side of me is like, engage her question, right? Okay, so may I move on?
Quick question.
Sure.
Did you test the scale on immediacy in this research?
Yeah, I did. So this was already a validated scale in the classroom base. And then another researcher had converted this to online back in 2004. So what I did, and he validated that as well. And then what I did was I updated that scale to be more relevant to today, because his scale is based on just basically text communication. And then I validated mine, and it came out to be quite valid.
What was your internal consistency?
Oh God, I can't even remember right now. It's in my paper. I'm so sorry.
What was your favorite?
It really is like, it's like post-traumatic stress sometimes. Yeah, I have the Chromebook alphas and everything everywhere. Yeah. Okay, yeah, great question. I should have just brought the whole thing with me today. So the frequency of communication. So again, looking at high immediacy instructors. High immediacy well, all instructors use email a lot, right? Instant messaging was used by 2 instructors in total. Students reported to be used by the instructors, rather. Social media and mobile text was not reported to be used by any instructors. So again, but I found that the number of communication channels used by an instructor was highly correlated, well, not highly, but correlated with the student's sense of immediacy. So instructors that used higher levels, again, at least 4 channels, for example, had more immediacy. And the threshold is around 7 for highly immediate instructors. We're using 7 forms of communication, at least the students reported, to communicate.
What was your population?
The population was online, fully online program students at Boise State University.
What I'm wondering is because I taught online with military,
Okay,
I think I'd get a completely different result. I really.
it's possible.
Because I mean, the immediacy, the phone calls, the
Mhm.
personal questions, just off the table. So,
I'm sorry, what do you mean by off the table?
well, I mean.
Like a lot of them or not so many of them?
Well, they're device actually.
Mhm.
So immediacy is, I mean, they get much more time to complete the job than greater students.
Yeah, well, so our courses are,
Shooting people.
our classes are highly interactive, multiple due dates per week, 7-week modules typically. They're typically working adults, not military or retired military, so they're U.S. station military. So yeah, they're not the, fully open module courses where they have their own, and they work on their own pace. Yeah, not that style.
And it's a lot more formal. I mean, sir, ma'am, kind of thing.
With your population, sure, right. But you're working basically with a subculture. You're working with a very narrow subculture of people. But, and the interesting thing is, immediacy construct, though, and this was cross-cultural studies have found with like a lot of Japanese studies, Chinese studies, have found that even among those cultures, though, if you use these high immediacy indicators with your students, the impact will actually be even higher with those students because they're not used to that. So if you're, for example, working in India or Japan with students in that culture, and you're a highly immediate instructor, they'll find you to be more immediate, obviously, than because they're comparing it to instructors that maybe are very, cold-faced, traditional, and so on. So it can actually have a higher impact with those students.
It's just because there's usually a time lapse.
Yes.
So they don't expect for the conversations span a lot longer time.
Right. Okay. So interesting thing. So comparing the high and low immediacy instructors, a lot of interesting gaps. For example, instructor videos, there's a pretty big gap, and feedback, right? The amount of feedback. Here, video conferencing, very big gap. So 44% of highly immediate instructors use video conferencing with their students, whereas the low immediacy instructors didn't use it quite as much. So across the board, we can see higher use of communication in general, and also bigger gaps in these synchronous types of communications, for example, telephoning as well. What do we got here? Yeah, so the channel of communication announcements surprisingly was very high immediately correlated with immediacy, which is interesting, right? Announcements, really. Okay, it seems such a basic tool. And one of the predicaments, if you're in a high enrollment course where all the instructors are using the same course copy, then you can't necessarily use those announcements. You have to use email instead, right, typically. So that was a high one. And then feedback, again, was also highly correlated. So I did also, again, a qualitative research as well. And again, it was mostly female. That's just the way it works out with our programs. Did have one male. Other demographics that were pretty diverse. And I found 5 themes. So one was commitment to the role of the instructor, like being really committed to their role was one of the themes. That they were really advocating for the students, not just being a facilitator, guide on the side and so on, not being a sage on the stage, but really advocating for their students, wanting to see their success. Being accessible and very responsive to students, providing extensive and continuous feedback, and encouraging and reassuring. So these were all the main themes that I had found. And so narrowing all the quantitative and the qualitative down, 7 findings really came out of it. And that they were, again, the instructors really provided a continuous engagement with their students. And I found 3 stages. Again, one was before the course even started. It was prior to the course. It could have been in the way they set up their self-introductions, the way they set up their announcements. Again, the text that they use, the way they use the text, emoticons. And a lot of that comes out of your philosophy, right? Your values, your beliefs. So all of that's going to be informing your design of your syllabus, informing your design of your course content and so on. Also, your reputation precedes you. What other students are saying about you as well. The second stage is that continuous responsiveness and feedback within the course itself while you're teaching it. Again, providing, students want 24 hours is what they want. And a lot of us are writing 48 hours or not available on weekends. Well, students are doing a lot of their work on weekends. And if you're not available on weekends, well, you're not really being responsive to them. You're not being as immediate as they really want. So that's something, if we're fully online instructors, we have to rethink that weekend mindset, right? Are we going to be there for our students? If you have a major assignment due on a Saturday night, you might want to reassess when you're going to have that due date, and so on. So again, being flexible and accommodating, and so on. Individualized feedback, the third stage, right? The feedback stage, where you're actually giving feedback, not just supporting them while they're doing their work, but actually after they've provided their work. Again, in your communication, John, you've done a great job on this assignment, right? Not just going right to that, the feedback. Being very specific, using cushioning, of course, we all know that. Students like it. Cushioning, the sandwich approach. Good job, here's where you suck, and here's where you're good again, whatever. The jam sandwich, whatever you want to call it. But also, in your feedback, being willing to openly engage your students. One thing that students didn't like was if you ask them a question in your feedback, and then they write back to you and you don't respond. Why did you use that approach? And they write to you, I use this approach because of this, and you never respond. It seems ingenuous to them. Also challenging them to think deeper and so on. Second, adaptive communication. This is what I was talking before. Being willing to elevate that level of fidelity to their need. So, if students, again, freaking out that they're having a problem, being willing to meet them. I did meet a student at 11 p.m. on a Friday night a few months ago. And it was a very intense situation. He had posted a screenshot in his presentation that had very offensive terms, like referring to pedophilia. And yeah, I thought I would have to contact either the police or academic integrity or somebody. But I did communicate with him, and it turned out he had just done a wrong search and a screenshot of what he thought was his computer, but he didn't look at the image. He thought he was doing a search of his computer, but he'd actually done a search of the internet. And then the thumbnail image that he saw looked similar to his computer, right? Because it's just a thumbnail. He clicked on it, posted it, and never checked his work, right? And when he first told me that, I was a little bit dubious, but I was able to replicate exactly what he had done and found the exact same offensive image doing the steps that he had said. And so, but it was because I was able to work with him at that hour, and I was willing to work with him at that hour, that he was able to feel that I was being immediate with him. It was scary. It was scary. Instructor videos. One of the things that was interesting was that instructor videos, while nice to have, may not be necessary if you're already achieving a threshold of immediacy. So if you're already being very responsive and helping them and explaining things to them, they're answering their questions, the videos are not going to hurt your immediacy, but there's a certain kind of threshold, right? Like, you know, you don't have to be like the perfect wife or boyfriend or husband in every single moment, but you do need to achieve a certain threshold with your spouse, right? And if you achieve that threshold, well, the other flowers that you give them might just be like, all right, it's enough flowers, get out of here, or whatever, right? So if you achieve a threshold, you may not need it. So videos were not a very strong indicator on their own. Positive tone that is consistent throughout the course, even when you're frustrated as an instructor, if you're relaying through a positive tone, which requires some internal searching, right? Because if you're getting frustrated and you're trying to pretend to be nice, students will pick up on that as well. But that positive tone in your writing and your speaking and your content and your feedback, that's one of the things the students indicated was very highly immediate to them. And also the sense of middleness, where you're not just nice and friendly all the time, but you actually challenge your students. Students really value being challenged by their instructors, being challenged and giving second chances to improve their work and so on, that flexibleness. And finally, humor was surprisingly had a very limited role in my study. I think that, in the classroom situation, you can use humor a lot more easily. Your demographic might be more similar to you also in a classroom because they're coming from the same region and so on. Online, you have a lot of challenges using humor. So that is basically the results of my study. Going forward, I think that this timeliness of response needs to be looked at more because, again, I've tried to bring my feedback on assignments down to 3 days from the due date. I do make that, students that submitted a week early, I'm like, look, you may be ready to submit early, but I'm not ready yet. I've put this time aside. If I can get to it early, I will, but 3 days within in a 7-week course, because they want that feedback so they can use it for the next assignment. So, and 24 hours for communication when they have questions. Usually the students were saying they want it within a few hours though, right? They don't want to wait 24 hours even. That's like their threshold of you being immediate though. So I wish we had more time to talk. It's already overtime, but if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me, Anthony Saba at Boise State. I'll give you a call if you're freaking out. I need to talk to you really bad. But yeah, thank you for your time, and I appreciate your attention. Thank you.
Can you post your PDF or your paper or something?
It's available through, what's it called for doctoral students? Yes, ProQuest. It's on ProQuest. It's in the thesis. Instructor Immediacy in Online Program Courses, I think is the full title. I can't remember now. It's not improving that. It's Instructor Immediacy in fully online program courses. Yes. It's in ProQuest. Yes, it's been published. Oh, wow, great. It's a little longer than I had hoped it would be, so it gets a little dry in the middle. Just scroll to the end. Yeah. I literally have not thought about it in about 5 months because I just but I have to again because we're doing AECT in October. So AECT, it's a conference that's really big for online instructors. This is the website for it. Is it TINA? No. Association for Educational Communications and Technology. Thank you, Max. Thank you. Oh, yeah. I hope I didn't
Oh, no, I think you already did.
Just
I just
do that for you,
I
or-
left this open. No, you're fine. You're fine. Okay.